next week sees the launch of the BBC's Sound of Cinema season, joined by film composer Neil Brand, who presents the three-parter. How you doing, Neil?
Very good, thank you.
Sound of Cinema, the music that made the movies. The idea is what?
The idea is a kind of a history and a kind of analysis of how film music has always worked and what's happened to it over the years, how it started, what we kind of expect of the cinema now. And we've gone for a sort of 3-episode structure, which is about genre rather than history. So the first one, you get the orchestral music, the sort of thing we expect. Second one, you get the use of popular music and the start of jazz, and then rock and Barry and Beatles and so forth up till now. And then the third one's the electronics and the rise of electronics, because you really can't ignore that now in music, particularly because electronics can be music and can be sound, and the two are becoming less and less separable as the years go by.
We'll talk more about that. Let's just play a clip from the series. Martin Scorsese, one of the many contributors to this series, here he's talking about how he chose the music for Mean Streets.
It wasn't even a question of it. I can never have a composer like Bernard Herrmann or Elmer Bernstein, or it's out of the question. You know, I knew I was going to make films somehow, but when I did, the soundtrack's up to me. And the music I knew, and the music that scored my life, and still does to a certain extent, is the music I heard growing up. So music was very, very much part of expression of who you are and how you feel. In reality, Mean Streets really takes place between 61 and 63, even though we shot it in 72. There was Phil Spector, and there was the Wall of Sound. And that's the sound I hear in my head. And that was the music that propelled all the action in the story, because that's what was playing in the middle of the night in those after-hour joints that we were in.
Fantastic tune, but just explain the significance of what he was talking about and the significance of Mean Streets and that 60s pop soundtrack.
Scorsese talks about using the soundtrack of his life, and he's one of the first to bring a whole slew of well-known numbers to a film, but then dramatise them in a way that is just unforgettably good. That first use of Be My Baby, for instance, at the top of Mean Streets, which is...
Boom, boom, and
exactly, and he cuts in twice on those beats. Yeah. Boom, boom, boom. That's just fantastic. And I think, you know, nowadays there is a question mark over the amount of known material put into film soundtracks. But at the time, I think what he was doing was completely dramatically valid. It's what he knew. It's how he saw life. And I love the moment, for instance, in Mean Streets where we're introduced to Robert De Niro and we get the Stones just crashing in. Jumping Jack.
But also get Rubber Biscuit, don't we?
Yeah.
Which is
the best thing of the lot.
Fantastic.
Where we watch Harvey Keitel getting more and more progressively smashed at a party to Rubber Biscuit, and on which, famously, you know, Scorsese put him in a chair and pushed him around with the camera on him through these crowds and then speeded the whole thing up. It is how it feels to be fantastically and then eventually regrettably drunk.
We were talking an hour ago with Richard Curtis, and he was talking about putting the music into his new movie, and they wanted to have Nick Cave, and they had to film a number of different versions just to make sure that they got, you know, in case they didn't get permission. But there are some directors who, I mean, he mentioned Tarantino as well, that we kind of expect that approach from now.
Absolutely. And again, with Tarantino, I think it goes even further. Tarantino doesn't just want to use this music that he knows. He actually wants to use his own versions of it so that he hears the clicks and scratches of his records on the soundtrack. Yeah, and again, it can work and it can't. I mean, there's been moments in Tarantino films where I've just felt the soundtrack just whizzed me along. There's been others where I've just gone, you know, hearing the Ironside theme 5 minutes into Kill Bill. You know, no, it just, it didn't do it for me. So I think it can work both ways. It's interesting that what Scorsese gave as a reason was that he had no money for a composer. Quentin Tarantino is on record as basically saying, I don't want to use a composer. I don't want somebody else to, as he put it, stink up my movie. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The series is really about the composers who work on these films and kind of put the music together. But of course, as part of that, nowadays, every composer is expecting to work with found music that's also in the soundtrack.
And just mention some of the key... We've mentioned Mean Streets. Just mention some of the other key moments which you knew that, you know, that were first on your sheet, the ones that you have to, the key moments, the key soundtracks that people will be waiting for, but also the stories that you were looking forward to telling?
Oh, but for me, things like Robin Hood, the Corn Gold score for Robin Hood, how that works. 38, I think, 37, 38. And that is, just a beautiful use of music to link together both the idea of an adventure film and a romance. And the same theme is for both Robin falling in love with Marion and Robin representing the honour of his country. And it's one of the first times where music just lifts a film way beyond the cinematic into something that feels like a kind of grand historic statement. It was great talking to Hans Zimmer. I was fascinated to meet him anyway. It was lovely going to his place because he actually does most of his work in a sort of factory of his own building, surrounded by people who work for him. But his own space is actually done out as a turn-of-the-century Viennese brothel. And he has a small keyboard area
like that somewhere.
If you also had kind of racks and racks of synths around it as well. And he was just fascinating about the work that he does. It was great for me to meet Richard Sherman. I'm enthralled, as I know the good doctor is, to Mary Poppins.
Well, I think it is one of the greatest scores ever written, because it's not just all of those songs are absolutely brilliant, but it's any of those tunes will work at any time of day or night. And we did this concert recently in which we played the overture from Mary Poppins. It was like hits on 45 of all the best songs you've ever heard ever.
Absolutely. And he sat down at the piano and played most of them for us. And then when he came to play Feed the Birds, Tuppence a Bag, that was it. I lost it on camera. And we haven't got that in the series, but it'll turn up at some stage, I'm sure.
Well, you started to cry?
I did, yes.
Why?
I remember
because
going
Feed
to see
the Birds.
Yeah, but why would that make you cry? I remember
seeing it when I was, I think, 7. It's one of the first films that had any great impact on me. I saw it in the State Cinema in Grays. I was living on a council estate in Essex. And it was this sudden realisation that there was that much colour out there and that much kind of life. And as the camera, I can still see it now, the camera came down across St Paul's, down onto, and you get those lines, the Saints of Apostles, look down. Whoa. And that was with me from the age of 7 till now. Actually, it's 48 years. So to then see the man who'd come up with it sit at the piano and play it, and at the end turn around and smile. And I couldn't think what to say except, if you're going to do that again, will you warn me? Which was all I could say.
We've done a couple of shows involving the BBC Philharmonic and choosing fantastic pieces of film music. And as soon as you start making a list, of course, it's a nightmare. But John Williams, clearly an important story to tell. And John Barry, you've mentioned in passing, but where do they fit in your series?
Well, John Barry, obviously very, very much the centre of the 60s for the use of popular music. I think he brings in big band sound, but uses it in orchestral ways. So you always get a lot of bang from Barry for scores, particularly the Bond films. You get a lot of brass, you get a lot of very heavy percussion, but he's the first one to really use them intelligently. He kind of fits them like jigsaw puzzles round the action. And he can turn on a sixpence. You will hear him, he'll have 5 or 6 themes across a film. I'm thinking of a movie, particularly one of my favourites, which is Thunderball, where he also sums up what it's like being under the sea. But it's still Bond. It's not just underwater music. It's Bond underwater, which means sex, which means potency. It's got this physicality to it. I just think he was remarkable in the way that he had this kind of breadth of ability to bring in all these different kinds of music. And it's because he was, I guess, he was the son of a cinema owner. He spent his kind of formative years going to see any films he wanted to because his dad ran a cinema. And then in the case of almost take any name, every composer I spoke to, they all had the same kind of feel about them, which was that they were very deep-thinking people. They were very, very unselfish, very generous with the way that they talked and what they talked about. Talking about Lamenti, and he gave us a whole kind of hour and a half of performance, which again, talking about Lynch. I had a tremendous time with Carter Burwell, talking about the Coen brothers and the way he works, and that's exactly the opposite direction to most composers, because Carter Burwell actually tries to do as little as possible. He always says there's too much music in films, too much music, so I do such small amounts of music you may not even realise it's a score. And in a movie like No Country for Old Men, it is hard to know if that's music you're listening to or if that is a sound from something else. It was a fantastic sort of thing for me to do, But I think I came out more than anything else surprised at how delighted I was with film scoring where it is now. I think people kind of go, oh, and all the sounds, it all sounds the same. It's all generic, etc. I don't believe it is.
No,
it's got such a
demonstrably
kind of
doesn't.
No, not at all. And people sort of say, oh, well, it's Hans Zimmer's fault. Well, no, it's not. Hans Zimmer scores films in his way. There are innumerable other composers out there now, quite often coming up from kind of grassroots, who've started off by using a computer in their own room and coming up with new sounds, who are going off in 100 million different directions and taking film with them. And I think that's a really good bit of news.
We were talking just a few moments ago about Mark Knopfler, and Mark was singing of his love of Dire Straits. And Mark Knopfler did some great soundtracks. In fact, Local Hero
is one of my favourite soundtracks of all time.
And Princess Bride, you have to say,
Princess Bride, great,
come on, Mark, let's do some more. I think he's given up on all that.
Yeah, well, Local Hero is brilliant. I remember talking to Bill Forsyth, and Bill Forsyth will say, I mean, he's being terribly modest, but he said 80% of why Local Hero works, according to Bill Forsyth, is the score. He said, believe me, you should see it without the music. It doesn't work.
Neil Brand, Sound of Cinema, the music that made the movies, begins 12th of September on BBC4. Neil, thank you very much indeed.